This is the Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Paul Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Cain McClary of KDT Ventures. Cain, thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into early stage investing?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great place to start. So I have a little different background than most. I'm a physician by training. I trained down at Tulane right after Katrina. And my first investment was actually made in 2010 when I was at the National Institutes of Health. We were trying to measure some things in the laboratory, and there wasn't a very good high throughput measurement system that was put in place. And a friend of mine from undergrad was actually spinning a technology out of MIT and had me test what he was building, and it actually worked really well, and said, hey, we need to raise some seed funding. And I said, I don't know what that means. I didn't know we were growing trees here. And he said, oh, no, we need some ultra high net worth folks to get around the table. And I said, well, I'm not ultra high net worth, but I'll give you whatever I have. And that was the first money I actually put into a deal. It was a company called Firefly Bioworks out of Boston. And fast forward 5 years, and it got purchased by a publicly traded company, Abcam. And it was really that first investment that got me hooked on venture. And so went back, finished my medical school, and quickly moved out to Stanford and Sand Hill Road. I trained in pathology at the time at Stanford. And to be honest, I was probably the worst resident that Stanford has ever had because I was constantly on Sand Hill Road working with large venture firms. I was wide-eyed when I got out there to California, thinking that I could somehow get all of the folks that were focused on social networks or picture sharing or other things like that in the digital world to start to focus on problems within the physical world. And so started to define large theses while I was out there from about 2012 to 2015 on what was going to happen at the intersection of first healthcare and computation, and then more broadly science and computation. And all the while I was deploying what little capital I had at the time in a variety of different companies, some of which you may have heard of. There's an outlier there, a company called Zymergen, which just took about $130 million from SoftBank at the time where I was first money in there. And then after I finished my residency, I joined a startup called Grand Rounds because honestly, as I was investing as an angel, I wanted to learn more operations and really sit in the entrepreneur's seat because, to be honest, I felt like a fake investing and advising entrepreneurs without having hands-on experience. And instead of shooting at the hip with theory, I wanted to actually have some paradigms of practice within that space. So sat at that company for 2 years. We went from about 30 employees to just over 300 in 18 months. You can imagine what a ride that was. I got to learn what the growing pains were of a large company. And then a year ago today, after about 9 separate angel investments and some very successful angel investments, I decided to institutionalize the fund and now have a seed Series A fund named KDT Ventures. And that's really how I got into it, Hall.
So that sounds great. So tell us more about KDT Ventures. What does the fund focus on and where does it go?
For sure. So KDT Ventures is really the brainchild of those years that I spent out in Silicon Valley focusing on the intersection of computation and broadly biology. So to me, just to start with, there has been great promise in biology for a number of years, really since we discovered the structure of that double helix molecule DNA. We've always thought that we could use that DNA to do a variety of different things, but that promise has never really been fully realized. And during my time out west, I really started to work on and chew on this idea of when are we going to realize all of that promise of this DNA that really drives everything in what I call the physical layer around us, and the physical layer being chemicals, agriculture, and medicine. And to me, when I think about it, DNA really is just source code. It's the same thing as electricity is on a transistor chip that may sit inside a computer, and then you write a program on top of that to manipulate that electricity running through the chip. Then you can do all kinds of amazing things in terms of applications when we deploy that. If you just look at our iPhone, you can see a number of those. And we should really reach a point in life where we should be able to do that with DNA and the physical layer around us. And what I centered in on in that thinking was that you really need 3 different things to enable the applications layer of biology to really happen. One, we needed to understand this source code or this DNA. And thanks to things that folks will have heard of like DNA sequencing, Illumina is a great example of that as a company, that reading of the source code itself or the code of life has commoditized to a point that we now have all of the instructions. All of a sudden we have the instructions not only in terms of that source code or DNA from humans, but we have source code from plants, we have source code from microbial species, and we have all of these different tool sets that came from that. There was also, secondly, it's not enough just to know the code, but we need to be able to write it, just like programmers are able to enter in different types of computer code into terminals and build applications on top of that. And luckily, thanks to the technological advances of DNA sequencing, paradoxically, we actually can now write DNA because sequencing in and of itself is actually a write technology. And I won't get too deep into that because I understand this is a little bit of a deep analysis of biology here. So we can read the code and we can write the code, but really what we had been missing for a long time is we'd been training PhDs to study some small niche of biology, some very basic process or premise within the lab. And then we expected them to publish papers and to read each other's papers and to sort of network that out and try to solve the big math problem that is biology. Well, it turns out it's a really, really difficult math equation. And it also turns out that computers are really, really good at solving really difficult math equations if given the proper data set. So all of a sudden we have lab tools that are spitting off all kinds of different data sets, whether it be image processing algorithms, whether it be genetic sequences, whether it be biochemical reactions. And we have what people will refer to now as frontier computational technology, so machine learning, artificial intelligence. And all of a sudden, if you start to point that lens at biology, so we know the code, we can write it, and we have these frontier computational programs, we can actually start to program the physical layer around us. And that can mean a number of things, and depending on what vertical you're talking about, whether it's chemicals, agriculture, or medicine. And KDT focuses at that intersection where we are starting to see tool sets within what I'll continue to refer to as the physical layer that enable us to build all kinds of different things. So you may have heard in the news of something called CRISPR or CRISPR-Cas. That to me is just a biological operating system on which you can build applications. And you see massive companies coming out of that, not only within medicine, but also within other verticals such as chemicals and agriculture. So KDT focuses is at that intersection of very deep technology.
Well, that's a great introduction into it. But from an investor's point of view, what do you actually look for in startups that you think fits this investment thesis here that you're going after?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. It's one that keeps me up at night, Hall. So what we're really looking for here at KDT are really platform technologies. And you'll hear that all the time in the SaaS world and the B2B world is you want platforms that are really malleable and that own the entire value chain within a stack. And so I can give some specific examples of those where you may have technologies that hijack certain parts of the body's immune system and that you could reprogram those, let's say, to not only fight cancer, but also fight autoimmunity, to also fight other types of diseases that we may get as humans. You're really looking for something that isn't just a singular application or a singular problem-solving tool. You want a tool set that is broadly applicable and ideally not only to a single vertical, but across different verticals. And a lot of that, to be honest, Paul, comes down not only to ingenuity of the entrepreneur, but also to the protection around that technology. So the world that I function in isn't as much of move fast and break things world. It is much more of how do I protect this technology that I have with intellectual property rights, which is unbelievably important in my world. And you can see that manifest right now in the very public battle between who owns the CRISPR patents, between the Broad up at Harvard and then UC Berkeley with Jennifer Doudna. And so intellectual property is very, very important in the world that I function.
So what's an example of a startup you've invested in that actually achieves what you just described?
Absolutely. So I can give you a specific example of a human therapeutics company to start with. And so There's a company out of Connecticut, out of the Yale School of Medicine called Azitra, Azitra. And what Azitra does is they studied the microbiome, which is the sort of milia or group of bugs that lives on or in the body. Specifically, they focused on the microbiome that lives on the skin. So most people are focusing right now on the microbiome that lives in the gut and trying to manipulate that. And what Azitra's done is they isolated the main bug that lives on the skin. So it makes up about 40% of the biomass of bugs that live on the skin. And what they've done is they've been able to take that bug, isolate it, grow it up, and then insert different products into that bug. So the bug is actually a drug-making factory that lives on your skin and can react to different conditions that your skin has. And so you apply it topically in a cream, and let's say you have eczema. And in eczema, we know that there is the lack of a very specific protein that is causing that itching and that redness. All of a sudden, you can reintroduce the bug that natively lives on your skin, and it can make the drug at the site of injury. And it can react to injury, make more drug, make less drug. And that is all done through sort of genetic reprogramming, if you will. That's a platform technology because it not only works for one disease, but you can imagine it's kind of like a cassette. You can drag and you can drop in different products, and that bug is going to make all of those different products. So let's say you could drag and drop in collagen, and all of a sudden you have a cosmetic. Or you can drag and drop in a specific gene that may be missing in a person with a specific genetic defect that has skin manifestation. And so all of a sudden you have this platform technology that can be deployed across a variety of different indications, all of which are, if you look from a market perspective, are worth quite a bit of money.
That's great. It sounds like it's the platform is really the key to making this all work. And how do you generate the patent protection around it? What are some of the strategies you're using there?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's very key here. And a lot of it is knowing a good patent lawyer and knowing good patent firms. And so there's a number of those both in Silicon Valley and in Boston that are very adept at protecting these types of technologies. It's also very important before you start to patent to understand freedom to operate. So where do I fit into the space? And then how do I land grab or own enough of the space so that I've created a moat around myself and I don't only have a narrow space to operate? So really it comes down to the law network or legal network that you're able to navigate. I also, as a sophisticated investor, read all of the patents, to be honest, Hall. I am someone that really digs in because actually the patents are quite informative as to business model and technological limitation as well. There's parts of it that you can skip because they're highly technical in terms of their legalese, but they're actually a great source of information for folks. And there's a number of firms out there that will actually use patents to start companies. So you may find a technology that a university has and then try to license that out. The patent is really where all of the information comes from there.
So how do you keep up on all those patents? Is there a way to sort through and find the right ones, or do you just take a very narrow focus in the area that you go after? There's got to be many, many patents in each of these areas.
Exactly, yeah. And so it really comes down to general thesis and sub-thesis that is below the fund's thesis itself. So the fund is focused at the intersection of really computation and biology, or using biology as its own computer. And then beyond that, so the way that Azitra was found was I have a thesis on production of biologic drugs in vivo, meaning not taking something externally from a pharmaceutical company, but actually hijacking parts of the body, whether it be our own cells or whether it be bugs that live on our body or in our body, to actually produce. So one, sense the environment, and two, produce from that environment. And from there, you can actually start to narrow patent searches, mostly through understanding who in the academic research labs around the United States are studying these various different thesis areas, if you will. And so once again, that's where technical expertise of managers of capital comes into play. And thanks to things like the Google alerts, I know every time that either a patent is filed from, say, a certain laboratory that I'm following that might have had a number of successes before in terms of successful startups, or when they publish a new paper out of which likely some type of IP will be generated. And so I'm constantly trying to mine those for information to find startups at the earliest stages of their inception.
What about grant programs? How does that fit into this? Do you monitor grants from NIH and other groups, or
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a number of tools and tool sets that are coming out now, and actually startups within that space that are helping to cull grants and grant sets for institutional investors. I'm constantly paying attention to mostly the SBIR network because as an investor, I love small business innovation research grants, which a lot of these scientific companies will have, because it's non-dilutive capital that will come in and it doesn't dilute me. And it can be on the order of $250 to $3 million, depending on what it is, which can be very significant in a startup's lifespan. The second thing, though, that I also pay attention to are DARPA, so the Defense Advanced Research and Projects. I look at their requests for proposals to see what's interesting to them and why, and then also look at companies that may have applied or won DARPA grants. And so, yes, I definitely pay attention to that landscape as well.
What's the role of the conferences in this? Do you find conferences to be a useful source, or do you find research on the web to be more effective?
Yeah, usually by the time the research has made it to a conference, it's too late, to be honest. The world moves really fast, particularly with the information being freely available these days online, and then a number of investment firms that are very interested in these. And so conferences for me are great for networking, particularly for talent and talent acquisition for my portfolio companies. So continuing to find folks at those conferences that may fit into a specific company or thesis area that I have. And then also to catch up with other investors, because it's always important. No one investor can see everything and do everything. And so it's important to establish those networks of investors to continue to have eyes and ears everywhere.
Well, it's great. We're near the end of our time in the last few minutes that we have. What else should we cover that we haven't?
Yeah, so a couple things that I'd like to touch on here in the last few minutes are the fact that the technologies that I'm talking about, and I feel like I have skewed a lot toward medical technologies, don't only apply to that. So the programmatization, let's say, of the physical layer also applies to things like chemicals and agriculture. And to me, those areas are really important. I don't call myself an impact fund. I don't call KDT an impact fund. It just so happens that every investment I make is impact oriented and has a double bottom line. And so where we can go with that is, let's say, within agriculture. And so I like to start macro, and then I drill down to sort of micro themes within my macro thesis. So with agriculture, within the next 30 years, we're going to add 2 to 3 billion people to the world. And all of a sudden, food safety or having enough food changes from being a logistical today, we have plenty of food, but we can't get it to people, to actually a yield problem if you just look at calories being produced and the number of people on the planet. And so that's a very large macro theme. But then if you start to drill down to the things that I'm talking about, are there ways in which we can produce yield or increase yield in plants today? And it turns out that all of these biological tool sets that I briefly touched on have applications within, let's say, agriculture. Same thing within chemicals. So chemicals right now, the entire chemical space is really based on what we can get out of a barrel of oil. So about 2/3 of a barrel of oil goes toward energy and about 1/3 goes toward material. And so what we're seeing today is through reprogramming of these microbes and using them to, say, become of their own small chemical factory, we can start to produce materials and things that free us from barrels of oil and free us from the effects and impacts of those types of barrels of oil. So the impact of these types of scientific advances goes far beyond just a monetary impact, but actually has an impact across different types of supply chains, both within the U.S. and outside of the U.S.
Well, great. Many good topics to dive in further in a follow-on interview, but today we're at the end of our time. How best for the audience to get back in touch with you?
Yeah, so feel free to first visit the website that I have, kdtvc.com. And so there you can see a lot of the writings that I have on Medium. You can feel free to email me, and that email, Cain, C-A-I-N, at kdtvc.com. And then you can also feel free to reach out directly through that website that I provided.
Well, great. We'll put that in the show notes and look forward to having you come back to dive in deeper into these topics. Appreciate your taking time to talk today. I hope to see you back again soon.
Thank you so much, Hall. Thank you for having me.
If Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.